All right. Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for joining us for today's Lunch and Learn on the business owners of color in Wisconsin, trends and outcomes. My name is Brandon Hofstad, and I'm the Community Economic Development Program Manager with the University of Wisconsin-Madison Division of Extension. And it's my pleasure to kick off the first of two webinars related to the Wisconsin Economies Series Report and Policy Brief, entitled Business Owners of Color in Wisconsin, Representation, Profitability, and Growth. And I'll drop that link in the chat here in just a short bit. Before we begin, I would like to thank the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation and the U.S. Economic Development Administration. Today's webinar was made possible in part by grants from the WEDC in support of the Rural Wisconsin Entrepreneurship Initiative and from the U.S. EDA in support of the EDA University Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And as per usual, a few housekeeping items. Today's meeting is being recorded. We will have final recording, PowerPoint slides, and other supporting materials online, and that will go out, and you'll have access to all the materials later. If you need closed captioning, you can find it at the bottom of your screen. There is the option to hit CC, and that will be enabled for you if you need it. As a friendly reminder, please be sure to mute your microphones when you're not speaking. We will have an opportunity with our presenters to have question and answer. And during the presentation, if you'd please drop the questions into the chat, myself and my colleague Todd Barman will be monitoring the questions, and we'll have that as part of the Q&A. But of course, when we get to the Q&A section, you're more than welcome to ask questions of our presenters. And if you don't feel comfortable sending a chat to the whole crew, you also please feel free to drop one to me. My name is Brandon Hofstad, and you should find me at the top of your participant list at the bottom of the screen. So in just a moment, I will turn it over to our two presenters, Dr. Tessa Conroy and Matt Curis. As I mentioned, today's webinar is related to a report and corresponding policy brief released earlier this year, which highlighted Wisconsin's spike in business ownership among non-white entrepreneurs. The report explores that despite this increase, the state continues to have an overall low number of businesses owned by people of color. So here today to present the findings of the report, and again, the report is the first part, and then the next one will be more of the action items, so the follow-up webinar on the policy brief, which will be on June 11th. Again, I'll drop that in the chat in just a second. So here to talk about the report and to share insights are our two presenters, Dr. Tessa Conroy and Matt Curis. And I'll start with Dr. Conroy. Tessa is an economic development specialist and associate professor of agricultural and applied economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She studies community economic growth and development, small business dynamics, and entrepreneurship. And she is one of the co-authors, along with Matt and Mary McDermott, on the report. And Tessa is joined by colleague Matt Curis. Matt is a distinguished community economic development specialist and an economic geographer. He works with state partners and local communities in several areas, including regional economic analysis, labor force research, socioeconomic impact analysis, and industry sector competitiveness. So with that, I will now turn it over to our presenters. Tessa and Matt, the floor is yours.
Hi, everybody. Welcome. It's good to be with you for today's conversation. As I'm presenting, I appreciate questions and comments. I think we have plenty of time for discussion. So even if I don't see you, feel free to speak up or put your comment in the chat, and Brandon, Todd, and Matt can be interrupting me or helping to interrupt me along the way. So today is going to be Business Owners of Color in Wisconsin, Trends and Outcomes. This is part of our Wisconsin Economy series. So the Wisconsin Economy series is a product line from Extension, from those of us in community economic development. We tend to do a report, which is a deep dive, data-driven, descriptive, kind of the lay of the land, which is what you'll be getting today, on a topic of choice that is relevant to Wisconsin. So in the past, we've done broadband, we've also done manufacturing as examples, among others. And then we also do a policy brief. In the policy brief, we do more about strategies, more about policy options, more kind of case study examples that are out there in terms of what we can do about what we described in the report. We have these two products already out, the report and policy brief. We anticipate also releasing some special features that highlight the specific experience by racial and ethnic groups. So we kind of want to honor the individuality of these stories. Some of the data limits us in lumping together different backgrounds, different people of color, and we want to try to discuss the unique experiences. So look for that in the special features, even more so than we do in the report and policy brief. As I mentioned, the Wisconsin economy, these products offer a deep dive into an important topic for Wisconsin. We might think of them as helping us answer these questions about what to support with economic development efforts, why we should support it, and how to support it. And I think the report does a good job of answering this question of what to support with economic development. I'm going to try to answer this question in several ways today, as well as why we should support it. I think that's what the report is about, and that will be the lay of the or the kind of agenda for today. And then the next time we come together, we'll talk about that how component and how to support it. So with that, I'll get started. What to support with economic development? I hope that the answer to this question in our eyes is pretty straightforward. We think that supporting business owners of color makes a lot of sense when it comes to economic development. When we think about a big picture answer to that question, one answer is we have a diversifying population in Wisconsin. So by age cohort, Wisconsin's population is increasingly diverse. So as we kind of go marching down the age spectrum and we look at age cohorts or groups, we're becoming more diverse. So just in terms of population presence, it's going to make more and more sense to think about the diversity of audiences that are part of our economic development goals. These audiences are also distributed across the state. I think sometimes depending on your perspective and kind of maybe where you've traveled or been around the state, it might be easy to think of primarily Milwaukee as the center of gravity for diverse populations in Wisconsin. And that's true to some extent. A large majority of our non-white populations are in more urban areas, but we want to draw attention to the fact that there are people of color distributed all across the state. Whether we're urban or rural, we want to be thinking about inclusive economic development and reaching a variety of audiences with our work. They're going to be, all of the residents of our communities are going to be important no matter where we go. These diverse populations are also going to be a key source of growth. So when we think about the baby boomers, for example, aging out of the workforce, when we think about the need for in-migration, the answer to some of those questions is placemaking and quality of life. What's going to make people want to live in Wisconsin? What's going to make people want to move here? What's going to help us offset some of those demographic challenges going forward? And we want to be an attractive place for people to live, for people to move to. And part of that is, again, this inclusive economic development. When we think about younger populations, why they would move here, we want to be offering an economic development picture that's attractive to all different types of people from a variety of backgrounds. So narrowing in on business owners in particular. So we kind of started with this big picture question of why we would want to be thinking about business owners of color and economic development. And this just starts with, those kind of big, broad population dynamics. But to think about business owners specifically, we want to make clear the economic significance of this particular group of business owners. So we have over 48,000 businesses owned by people of color in Wisconsin. That makes about 11% of all businesses in the state. They employ 55,000 workers and generate over 1.6 billion in payroll. And just to give you a picture of what this looks like, we have the graphic here on the left. So we have a pie chart that's going to represent all roughly 450,000 businesses in Wisconsin. And we have that almost 49,000 owned by people of color. Our language here is a little bit limited sometimes. So this graphic uses the language minority-owned businesses. We try to be consistent with our data source. Oftentimes we're using census data, so we use census language. It's going to be one of the limitations of our report, unfortunately. And to say a little bit more about the data, Matt's going to share with us.
Good afternoon, everyone. Indeed, one of the questions we get quite a bit about this report and these figures is where does the information come from? And the primary resource that we've used for this report is the U.S. Census Bureau's annual business survey. And this replaces a survey format that came out every 5 years called the Survey of Business Owners. And one of the benefits of using this new survey is it does come out on an annual basis, and it's based on responses to the survey directly from business owners, but it also pulls in information from the economic census and other administrative records. Even though it does come out on an annual basis, there are significant lags in terms of when the data is collected and when it's released. So some of the numbers that you'll see in this report may seem like they're a little bit dated, but they're actually based on some of the most current information available to us at the time of publication. And this survey collects information based on all sorts of economic and demographic characteristics for business owners based on their race, their ethnicity, their gender, their status of whether or not they're a veteran. Because of the detail included in some of this information, the geographic coverage is often limited to states, the United States, and metropolitan areas. So unfortunately, we can't really dig into some of this information at maybe the county level that some people would like. And it also requires the Census Bureau to suppress some of the data to limit kind of disclosure of some of the information from individual entrepreneurs. So in some instances, we'd like to dig into the data a little bit more, but we just simply can't. And what the annual business survey does is measures firms. So the difference between a firm and establishment is that a firm may have many different establishments, but it is a single ownership group, whereas an establishment may be owned by a firm, but there may be many of them located throughout the United States. So if we think about franchises, we think about multi-unit operations for all sorts of different retail types. That's the difference between firms and establishments. And they are only collected for firms that have receipts of $1,000 or more. So that is a limitation as well. If there are some individuals that are operating a business that may not be collecting a lot of receipts, that would allow them to be included here. Also importantly, it does not capture or may undercount informal business operators, which, like we just talked about with the receipt limitations. It may not include undocumented operators. It may not include English language learners or other individuals that may be distrustful of government forms. So there may be instances where individuals receive the survey, but just aren't simply comfortable with either responding to it or responding to it truthfully. That said, there are some other resources out there that we can use to look at this information from the U.S. Census Bureau, from the SBA, and some other resources. So if there are data points that you may have interest in that are not included in this report, there may be some opportunities to further dig in.
Sorry about that, Matt. I didn't mean to rush you. I
All good.
accidentally clicked there. Okay, thank you, Matt. So now that we know a little bit more about the data, so there is this split between the new release of the annual business survey, and that's the more recent data product from the census that we're using. Prior to that, it was the survey of business owners. And so if we want to take a historical perspective of what's been happening in Wisconsin, we actually have to go back to that survey of business owners. And we can't stack that data the way we would hope to, because there are enough differences that we'd have to be pretty careful about that. So this is using the survey of business owners going back to 1997. That's the lightest green. The most recent release of that was 2012. Yes, it's data, but it's kind of the only way we have to look at a longer term perspective. And we've broken this out by race and ethnicity to the extent possible. So we have the American Indian, Asian, Black or African American, and Hispanic or Latino categories here. And we can look at growth over this period. And I think this is really important and interesting because this is going to span 2 recessions. So early 2000s, as well as the Great Recession. And we see the story of really remarkable growth. American Indian owned businesses growing by 1/3, Asian owned more than double. Latino owned triple, and Black owned nearly quadruple. So at a period when white owned businesses, non-Hispanic white owned businesses only grew by about 10%, we're seeing business owners of color, finding ways of success. So I think this is a real opportunity to think about what can be learned in terms of economic growth, and also a real asset in our communities to leverage for growth into the future. And we also want to be paying attention to this, momentum. The trajectory here is really one of increasing in number, increasing in economic importance, and increasing in the, attention that we want to be thinking about with this group of business owners. So just another answer to that question of, what and why do we want to be supporting with economic development efforts. When we think, about business owners and we think about growth and the role they play in the economy, it's entrepreneur is a term that can mean a lot of different things. And sometimes we have a bias of thinking about entrepreneurs as being kind of a particular thing, or we think about a particular category. So sometimes for some audiences, that means just pre-venture and aspiring business owners. Sometimes this means survival or sort of necessity business owners, people that are just kind of trying to scrape by. So they cobble together maybe a business. Social entrepreneurs that are focused on social impact, lifestyle entrepreneurs, almost hobbyist kind of entrepreneurs we might think about. Some are high growth, some are serial entrepreneurs starting multiple businesses. We also have the kind of one man and one woman shop type entrepreneurs. And our data here is going to be inclusive of a wide variety of different types of entrepreneurs. We're sort of agnostic about what the term entrepreneur means. I do want us thinking about the full range of possibilities, though. One distinction we're going to make that's really important is the difference between businesses that have employees and businesses that don't have employees, because it signals to us potentially a really important difference in growth trajectory and opportunity for these two types of entrepreneurs. So we will be thinking a little bit about that. But our data here is pretty, again, agnostic or inclusive. Lots of different types of entrepreneurs are going to be captured with the graphics that we're looking at. When we think about why these entrepreneurs are important, again, kind of coming back to a bigger picture answer, when we study entrepreneurs, even in this sort of agnostic or inclusive way, we see that entrepreneurs are linked to income growth and poverty reduction. Entrepreneurs are linked to regional stability. They're linked to innovation, sense of community, and job creation. So these inclusive, entrepreneur-focused strategies, we would expect to bring us a wide range of economic benefits, and just yet another reason to be thinking carefully and inclusively about entrepreneurial economic development. So another aspect of this question that we want to just spend a minute on is thinking about the size categories of businesses owned by people of color. One narrative that we have run into in some instances is, well, these businesses are predominantly small. So maybe some groups thinking like that the investment isn't going to have as big of a return because these businesses are primarily that kind of one man or one woman shop. And we want to answer that and make clear that there are businesses across the size spectrum here. So we have in this graphic sales buckets, basically across the x-axis, and then the number of firms on the y-axis. And what you see by size category is from the smallest to the largest. We have businesses in every category, and actually for businesses owned by people of color, the largest bucket, the way we've designed them here, is in businesses with $1 million or more in sales and receipts. So lest you think these are primarily small businesses or just survival businesses, I would think that this graphic is a good to balance out or even correct that way of thinking in terms of, again, we're talking about entrepreneurs of all different sizes of businesses. And then in thinking about the potential of what it would mean to make progress, Matt is going to talk about the benefits of potentially achieving parity in Wisconsin.
Indeed, obviously we see that there's been significant growth among business owners of color in the state of Wisconsin, but we do know that the rates of ownership are below those for their white non-Hispanic counterpoints. So when we think about some of the economic and employment benefits that are provided by entrepreneurs, we can ask ourselves, what would the impacts be on the number of firms or the number of employees or the additional income generated if business owners of color own firm at the same rate as white entrepreneurs in the state of Wisconsin? So in other words, what if Wisconsin reached parity in terms of these ownership rates? And we can see that the results are significant in terms of their impacts. So we can see that If we reach parity, there would be an additional 29,700 non-employer firms in the state of Wisconsin. There'd be almost 16,000 additional employer firms. The number of jobs added by these employer firms would be almost 152,000 employees in the state. And we'd also see additional payroll receipts in terms of the income generated by these jobs increased by almost $4.5 billion. So these are not small numbers, and they would have a significant impact on many parts of the state.
Thanks, Matt. So we have a large number of businesses owned by people of color, small relative to the state with lots of potential for growth. We also have lots of benefits but generated by these business owners. And so given all of these good things, all of these benefits generated by entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs of color in this case, we want to be thinking about, well, what would happen if we address those challenges? We have all of these potential gains in terms of what we could accomplish through parity, if that were the goal. And we have some evidence of challenges. So these are the things that we could, that tell us we could probably be doing better when we look at the data. So one is that business owners of color represent 11% of businesses, but 19% of the population. So we have underrepresentation of businesses owned by people of color. And that's what we're showing you here with the graphic in figure 4. So the light green is the share of classifiable firms. So that just means like of the ones that we can identify by race, which is most. What share is owned by each racial or ethnic group, and then what is their share of the population. And other than the Asian category, we have underrepresentation, and the largest or most kind of severe underrepresentation among the Hispanic or Latino population in Wisconsin. So again, evidence of challenge. We would expect these to be about even in parity, again, if that's our benchmark, but we're seeing some pretty big gaps. We'll see that Wisconsin ranks 50th for the rate of business ownership among people of color. So another signal that we're maybe not doing as well as we could be, or we have this opportunity for growth, for investment. And we'll see that business owners of color are much less likely to own businesses with employees. So that might signal to us some growth barriers and point to some strategies for us. And we'll be discussing those next time around. We'll also see that business owners of color tend to be concentrated in low sales sectors, so sectors that aren't earning as much. And even within those sectors, they're earning lower than average sales. So some real barriers to income generation within these businesses. That's probably linked to low barriers of entry and a kind of system of other challenges as well, which we don't want to ignore. So with these next few slides, I'm going to try to lay out the data behind those bullet points. So here in figure 13, we're looking at, I want to rearrange my screen a little bit here, if you'll bear with me. We're looking at the growth of the minority share of the population from 2012 to 2021 versus the growth of businesses owned by that same category from 2012 to 2020. We had to wiggle the years just a little bit because of data availability, but largely looking at the same period. And so as much as business owners of color or businesses owned by people of color have grown in number, and that's exciting and noteworthy, another way to contextualize that figure is whether or not this is really just keeping up with population growth. So in order for us to be making progress, we would actually want the growth in business ownership probably to outstrip population growth, because that would tell us that we are actually maybe breaking down some barriers, or that we're increasing opportunities for entrepreneurship. But when population and business ownership are increasing at the same number, it just kind of says, well, we have more businesses because we have more people. And that is likely not meeting our policy and strategy goals. So that's what this figure does. We're looking at population growth compared to business growth. And we see in Wisconsin that these are fairly close. Our growth of businesses does slightly outstrip population. I would say that that's, some evidence of a good sign that maybe we're increasing opportunity and relaxing some of those barriers. But when we look at a state like Iowa, for example, we see even more dramatic kind of gap between the growth in business ownership versus the growth of the diverse population in the state. So just again, another way to think about the dynamics here. We have our first of a couple great maps from that.
Here we're just looking at the geographic distribution of minority-owned employer businesses. So again, these are firms that have at least one paid employee as part of their operation. And here we're looking at it essentially on a per capita basis or based on the number of residents per state. And what we've done is to split the states into 5 different quintiles from the lowest ownership rate to the highest ownership rate. And in terms of employer firms, we do see that Wisconsin tends to be on the lower end when compared to many other states, but not quite as low as some of our neighboring states like Minnesota and Michigan. We do see some clustering of higher rates on both the East Coast and the West Coast, as well as in some of the Great Plains states as well. And Tess, if you go to the next slide, please. Thank you. We see a somewhat different pattern for non-employer businesses. And Tessa mentioned that Wisconsin ranks 50th in terms of ownership rates for business owners of color. And one of the driving factors in that ranking is our very low ownership rate among non-employer businesses. We are close to the bottom in terms of non-employer business ownership rates for business owners of color. Again, you do see some higher ownership rates on the East Coast in particular. You do see lower ownership rates in a number of Midwestern and Great Plains states. But one thing to keep in mind about the state of Wisconsin and the ownership rates for both employer and non-employer businesses is that Wisconsin tends to have a lower ownership rate among businesses of all types and all ownership. So we just tend to own smaller number of firms on a per capita basis compared to many other states. So when we think about that, we do have to realize that there may be other maybe cultural, structural factors at play that explain some of these differences in ownership rates, but nonetheless, in terms of minority-owned firms, Wisconsin has some work to do to reach parity.
Thanks, Matt. If you are particular about the data and wondering where that number 50 ranking comes from, it would be if we combine these two maps. So it's really driven by the low rates of non-employer business ownership. And if we were to look at a total rate of business ownership, combining employers and non-employers, that's going to get us to that 50th ranking. So we kind of did a simplified figure or simplified statistic there. Okay, so as we mentioned, this kind of size split between employers and non-employers is important. So here we have on the left minority-owned businesses and the share that has employees versus the share that does not have employees in orange. So with employees in green, without employees in orange. And we see that 88% of businesses are without employees. That's interesting when we compare to non-minority owned businesses, which is 77% without employees. So to contextualize a little bit further, in the United States, about 75% of businesses do not have any employees. That's kind of the benchmark. It's not unusual to see a non-employer dominated graph, but I do think this difference of more than 10 percentage points is really important for us to understand or start thinking about growth barriers for business of color. So why is it the case that business owners of color aren't employing workers at the same rate as their non-Hispanic white counterparts? And I think the answer to that question is important to inform policy and strategies. It would likely signal some barriers to growth that would be important to address going forward. Here's another way of thinking about that breakdown between employer and non-employer firms. So here we have a bar chart by race and ethnicity. So before we were lumping different racial and ethnic backgrounds all together, and here we're able to get into a little bit more detail. So when we look at the American Indian population, we see that about 9% have employees. When we look at the Asian-owned category, about 24%. So actually a flip-flop here in terms of a little bit more on par with the non-Hispanic white population. Black or African American have the smallest share of businesses with employees at just under 4%. and then at 11% for Hispanic or Latino. So this is, again, a space where we want to highlight the unique experience across racial and ethnic groups, because these kind of particular challenges of growth are already starting to look different. And we want to be thinking about that in terms of effective policies and strategies.
And here we're looking at ownership based on the percentage of firms owned by individuals in each sector of the economy. And again, these are employer-owned firms, or firms with at least one employee. And we do see some distinct differences here in terms of the distribution of minority-owned and minority-owned businesses in terms of where they're concentrated by different industries. One observation about this distribution is that business owners of color are more highly concentrated in several sectors that typically have lower capital requirements and lower barriers to entry for both starting and operating firms. So for instance, we do see higher shares of minority-owned businesses in firms like healthcare and social assistance, industries like retail trade, and industries like accommodation and food services compared to non-minority-owned businesses. On the flip side, we do see higher shares of non-minority owned businesses in industries like manufacturing, like finance and insurance, as well as in construction and wholesale trade. I think importantly, this distribution also somewhat mimics the employment distribution of employees in color by sector. In other words, employees of color are disproportionately found in industries such as healthcare and hospitality. So it really shouldn't surprise us too much that many entrepreneurs start firms in those industries where they have some background or experience. And as Tessa noted earlier, that many of the firms that we do see higher concentrations of minority-owned firms tend to be in industries that do have a lower average sales by sector. But that said, if we look at the average sales by sector, regardless of barrier to entry or capital requirements, we do see that non-minority owned firms do tend to have higher average sales than minority owned firms. And in some instances, we do see significant differences. So if we look at the difference between minority average sales and non-minority average sales in industries, like information or retail trade, we do see much higher average sales for those non-minority owned businesses. We do also see that industries like manufacturing and wholesale trade, which do tend to have smaller shares of ownership among minority-owned firms, do tend to have some of the highest average revenues for those ownership types.
Manufacturing is one sector, Matt, we haven't had a chance to connect on this, where we actually see minority average sales being significantly above non-minority average sales. We dug into this a little bit. One thing that might be happening here is, because this is an average, this might be covering up, one, two, or a handful of really large minority-owned firms that are pulling the average up, even if the most common scenario is one where we see businesses owned by people of color on average earning less. So this might be due to a couple of outliers, but with our data, that was sort of hard to suss out for sure. Matt, is that consistent with your...
Absolutely. And I think if you look at some of the differences in the construction industry sector as well, that you may see similar kind of nuances there in terms of the differences.
So one more way of kind of thinking about this performance gap between businesses owned by people of color versus non-Hispanic white-owned businesses is to take a ratio of average sales. So an analog to this, I have a background in thinking about gender differences in the economy. So if we think about the gender wage gap and we say something like women earn 88 cents on the dollar for every dollar earned by men, this is a similar idea here. So the bar chart captures this sort of ratio of earnings. So on average, or we could say the average business owned by a Native American or Alaska Native earns 48 cents compared to a dollar in the average white-owned firm. So these ratios are really pretty dramatic. So 42 cents on average earned by Black or African American owned businesses compared to $1 earned in a non-Hispanic white owned firm. So I think these gaps are really kind of striking and important for us to understand when we're thinking about what are the challenges and where should we be looking in terms of strategies and policies. And then the line chart here is average sales in general. So you can get a sense of the ratio as well as just the overall magnitude.
And if we look at the distribution of firms by sector for non-employer firms in this instance, we do see some similar differences in terms of the distributions that we saw with the employer-owned firms. That said, for both minority-owned businesses and non-minority-owned businesses, we do see kind of a shift towards those industry sectors where you may be able to operate your firm with no employees. So for instance, if we look at the high ownership rates in a sector like professional scientific and technical services, that could be someone running a software development firm or,
Sorry.
Okay, or being an individual accountant. So you may not have to have the additional employees to operate in that industry space. That said, we do see some differences in terms of ownership among minority-owned businesses and non-minority-owned businesses for non-employer firms. In particular, we see a much higher share of ownership concentrated in the transportation warehousing sector, as well as the other services sector, which does include many personal services. For non-minority businesses, we do see higher shares of ownership in industry sectors like real estate and rental and leasing, as well as in construction and the aforementioned professional scientific and technical services. So again, we do see concentration in some of those industries that do mimic what we see for employment patterns overall for employees of color. And again, we do see some concentration in those sectors that tend to have lower capital requirements and lower barriers to entry. And again, if we look at average sales for non-employer businesses, we also see somewhat similar pattern that we saw with the employer-owned businesses, that being average sales among minority-owned firms tend to be lower than those for their non-minority-owned firm counterparts in almost every industry sector. Again, the one that you do see a bit of a difference in terms of minority-owned firms having a higher average sales rate is in the manufacturing sector that Tessa had just mentioned a minute ago. Retail trade being the other one where average sales are higher among non-employer minority-owned firms than their non-minority owned counterparts.
And here we're looking at that ratio again. So what does an average business owned by a person of color earn relative to the average non-Hispanic white owned firm? And we see pretty dramatic ratios. The exception here would be in the Asian owned category, but in general, we see that businesses owned by people of color earning a fraction of what a non-Hispanic white owned firm is earning on average. Just to kind of wrap things up before we get into discussion and we look forward to your comments, we just want to again highlight that our report focuses on pre-pandemic trends just because of data availability, but what we learned from that is that we have a small but growing number of businesses owned by people of color. So this is, a number of businesses that is important economically, but only likely to become more important going forward to really harness the importance of this segment of the business community. We want to be thinking about what challenges there are to address, and there are signs of challenges, and that's what the kind of back half of our presentation really focused on, is what is the evidence of challenges. And going forward, when we come together next time, we'll be thinking more deeply about what we can do about those. I do think, though, that the report makes clear that there is a promising and economically important future for business owners of color in Wisconsin. One thing that we do know about the pandemic is that we had a record-breaking increase in entrepreneurial activity. We don't know yet a lot about the kind of demographic makeup, but if we can assume that that's even if we were to say evenly distributed across the population, that's going to be more entrepreneurship from people of all different backgrounds, all different types, and we want to be thinking seriously about inclusive economic development and about inclusive business support for these entrepreneurs, so that we can, of course, benefit individual entrepreneurs and their ability to generate income for themselves and create employment for themselves, but also think about those community-wide benefits in terms of stability, innovation, employment, job creation, etc. So with that, I'll wrap it up and open up the floor for discussion. We look forward to your comments and questions. Thanks for your time today.
Great. Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Tessa. And now this is an opportunity for folks who have questions. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question directly to our presenters, or you can also drop questions in the chat. So are there any takers? While people are kind of gathering their thoughts, I do have a question to kick it off. You had the map, I believe it was, that had the difference in the population growth and the business ownership across those Midwestern states. I don't recall if you explained this, or can you go into more detail as to, or if you have it, like what are some of the explanations for some of the differences? So for instance, Iowa had a pretty large gap there in Wisconsin versus Minnesota and Michigan, which were sort of the inverse of those. Do you have any other explanation or ideas as to what's happening there?
Let me throw up that graphic once again so that people can have a look. This is what you're asking about, Matt. So we're comparing population growth here to business growth over this kind of last decade or so. And to be honest, I don't think we understand this fully. This is a place for us to be doing more research, but it certainly shows regional variation. So what is happening in Iowa that's maybe not happening in Wisconsin in terms of gains of business ownership? I think we have some anecdotal evidence in terms of maybe large growth of an immigrant population. Immigrant populations tend to be roughly twice as entrepreneurial as the native born population. So I suspect that to the extent that the growth of the minority population is coupled with the growth of the immigrant population specifically, that's one way we might explain some of these differences. I have a sense that it probably has something to do with industry. Some states are more concentrated in industries that have greater ease of entry. So Wisconsin, that is maybe like historically a manufacturing state, that's going to create difficult entry compared to, for example, we saw a lot of the service sector industries are easier to enter. And so industry composition, I think that the composition of the diverse population is also going to matter here. But these are kind of my educated guesses and a space for more research. Matt, I want to invite you to add on. You will probably also have some insights here.
No, I think you covered the two factors that I would have mentioned as well, and I do think we will have an opportunity to dig into this a little bit more as we get the kind of the post-pandemic numbers released over the next year or so.
Thanks, Brandon.
Yeah. And Steve, I see that you dropped the question in the chat. I'm happy to ask it, but I don't know if you want to unmute and ask the question.
Yeah, good work, guys. Do you have any idea from this data how many of these businesses are the person's primary source of income and how many of them are kind of side businesses or side gigs? I don't know if you can answer that from this data.
I do, but I'm going to cheat and look it up because I want to get it right for you. So the data itself doesn't really tell us, like, is this this person's primary source of income, for example, but the Federal Reserve Bank has done some survey work and they asked this question, is this business your primary source of income? And I think it's the majority, even of these small non-employer businesses, which we might dismiss as like, oh, somebody's hobby or somebody's like Etsy project, are I think we should be careful about drawing conclusions like that. So I want to look up this number for us.
Okay, so it would be reasonable to say that if you grab one of these businesses at random, it's the likelihood of this being their primary job is pretty high.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you.
I want to say it's like 65% even of non-employer businesses are still their primary source of income. And employer businesses is even more likely because these are just larger businesses with more employees, et cetera.
Good point. Thank you.
Great. And again, please don't feel shy. Unmute if you have questions for the presenters or comments.
It is 2/3. I just found it. Sorry for those of you who had to watch me search for that number. I put the report in the chat if people want to look at that Federal Reserve data about non-employers.
I have another question. So it's similar to the one I just asked about the difference between population growth and business ownership. In the earnings ratio for employer and non-employer, that gap again was pretty stark. And can you speak a little bit? Is there something to do with because I assume this is all industries together? Is it where they're kind of clustered, and did you see difference when you started to kind of control for or look at some of that? Was there a difference in that pay gap between the dollar earned for non-Hispanic white?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Brandon. I'm going to share my screen again just to kind of clarify what we're thinking here. So this is this figure. This is the employer version of the figure that Brandon is referring to. So again, all industries are included in this ratio. So we're taking an average across all industries for businesses owned by people of color, and then average across all industries for white-owned businesses, and taking a ratio, and that gives us this gap of dollar earned, or in this case, cents earned per dollar earned for businesses owned by people of color. So what's important here is that, yes, this is going to include all industries. So these differences in industry composition are going to be really important when we're looking in this slide. To the extent that business owners of color are concentrated in lower sales or lower earning sectors, that's going to matter here. But I think it also highlights kind of the systemic nature of challenges, right? So industry choice is going to be really important. So when we're thinking about, well, okay, business owners of color seem to be on average choosing different industries than our non-Hispanic white business owners. Why is that? Is that a question about training? Is that a question about educational background? Is that a question about access to capital? And so this is just the tip of the iceberg. This is all industries that I think signals larger problems. If we want to get particular here, though, and think about industry-specific earnings gaps, this slide is going to help us think about those, because as you go marching across industries here, kind of left to right, you see that the orange bar is almost always lower than the green bar. So what that means is that if we took that ratio by industry, we're going to still end up with a value less than 1. And so we're still going to have earnings gaps across most every sector in the economy.
And Tessa, I'll just add that we did try to decompose the different factors in terms of industry distribution as well as earnings gaps within industries, but we just simply didn't have the data available to us because of data suppression issues.
Thanks, Matt.
There is a question in the chat before turning to it. It's a great question, but Todd, I saw you unmuted, and not to put you on the spot, but did you have a question?
Yeah, but I do, but we can cover the one in the chat first, and then I'll ask mine.
Okay, Diana, I'm going to offer the same thing. Did you want to ask the question?
Sure, yeah. This is really nice, guys. I'm curious if there's data out there on how much debt any of these businesses have, since the entrepreneurs of color are in cheaper industries to get started in. Can you tell, especially in the bigger sector, the bigger ticket item sectors, if there's more debt happening in across any of these groups? Is that tracked anywhere?
Good question, Diana. So here are a couple of things. To answer your question in brief, no, I can't name a specific source of data on debt off the top of my head. That said, the Federal Reserve report that I linked to does include some information about financing. And here are some things that I think are important to think about. My hunch is that the level of debt is actually not greater for people of color because of issues like the collateral requirements have actually been increasing over time. And so to the extent that our communities of color have less wealth, they're going to be in less of a position to collateralize their debt. And so that's going to affect access, for example. Also, in just like anecdotally in circles that I've been in, there's also a distrust of financial institutions, so a reluctance to take on debt because of that factor. And so kind of specifically choosing businesses that are industries that don't require debt because of these larger systemic problems. So I think you bring up a really important point here about debt, and I don't think that we should look at lower levels of debt in communities of color if that is in fact the case, and view that as a good thing.
Yeah, okay, that's what I was wondering about, the implications for lending. And even though people are cranking out this much output or income, a lot of that might be leveraged amongst the white-owned businesses potentially, which is still income and still great, but okay, thank you.
Thanks, Diana.
I know Mia has a question too, but I'll jump in with mine for both Tessa and Matt. As you walked us through this data, there were a number of times where you talked about one of the explanations for variations in what we were seeing was barriers to entry. And I know certainly that capital investment requirements or access to capital was a specific barrier to entry that you mentioned. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what kinds of other barriers to entry you guys might have in the back of your minds.
Matt, do you want to start? I have some, but you.
Sure. Obviously, as you mentioned, Todd, capital requirements is a barrier to entry. But part of it just may be the skills you need to acquire. Some industries require different educational attainments, different time on the job requirements, things like that. So in some of those sectors, it may be harder for business owners of all type to start that type of business just because of those other requirements. Networks could be a barrier to skill. Tessa, do you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I probably want to emphasize networks because I mean, we even see this with women-owned businesses that, the extent that you have a mentor or group of peer business owners that can help you problem solve, share information, be generous with introductions, that sort of informal kind of soft, squishy underbelly of owning a business is actually what we're learning really important, more so than we probably fully appreciated in the past. And so the relatively small number of business owners of color, a relatively small number of women-owned businesses means that there are just fewer mentors out there, that an aspiring entrepreneur is less likely to know a woman or another entrepreneur of color. And so access to those networks becomes more challenging. And so the information disadvantage, the implications for your propensity to become an entrepreneur, the implications for your success if you do enter business is really impacted by that network access and the connected information disadvantage. Yeah.
Great, thanks, that helps a lot. And then Mina, do you want to ask your question verbally or do you want me to read it?
I can ask it. I'm having video issues here, or camera issues. But I love this presentation. Did you have any like aha moments, surprises when you were collecting the data? Anything that surprised you? Anything that stood out to you?
I can share mine, and then I'll be curious if Matt has another one. So for me, I have been intrigued by the growth of non-employer businesses for a while. So it's interesting to me when I first got started doing this that businesses without employees are the majority of businesses in the United States. But what's more interesting is how dramatically they've grown in the last 20 years. We seem to be in the midst of a real kind of structural shift maybe in the economy, where businesses are sort of getting smaller on average. We have more one-man and one-woman shops, so a group of contractors coming together. So if you think about a newspaper, like a journalist is a contractor, and a photographer is a contractor, and your design layout is a contractor. So now we have 3 very small businesses in the place of maybe what used to be one larger news company or something like that. So there's this shift in the economy, and the dominance of business owners of color in that non-employer space is really interesting to me. And it's something that I'm actually trying to understand with some more rigorous research as to what extent are communities of color sort of driving this structural shift in the economy. And what we're learning is that in places that are more diverse, we're seeing this shift happen even faster than in the rest of the country. So that was something that was really interesting to me.
And my aha was actually on the employer side of establishments. Just looking at the differences in ownership rates among employer firms for business owners of color versus all business owners, that lower rate and what it would correspond to in terms of we reach parity for payroll employment is almost $4.5 billion in additional payroll. I mean, that is a very large number that really surprised me. I think that's almost 3 times of what the existing payroll amount is.
And Steve, I see your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on Tessa's observation. Do you think that shift to more kind of self-employed, is that being driven by the workers' preferences? They want to be kind of independent. They want to kind of have more control over their businesses, or is it because they're kind of being forced into it? For an accountant, for example, they would rather be employed by somebody, but that's not where the jobs are at. So they kind of have to start their own business. Do you have any kind of insights in what's driving the cart there?
So is it preferences, or is it sorry, what was preferences versus
the labor market is shifting in terms of the demand for jobs, or is it the workers are kind of revealing a preference for self-employment?
Yeah. My answer to your question is yes. I think it's both things, right? So I think there is this kind of preference element. I think that maybe is especially emblematic in our post-pandemic years. It's like the workers had a taste of flexibility and working from home. And I think we're still kind of sorting out where that's going to land, but I don't think we're going to go back to where we were because those preferences have maybe become stronger. But I also think that like these recessions in the last 2 years have sort of forced businesses to become maybe more risk averse or more conservative. And so from a business owner's perspective, like I can lay off my team and then just hire them back as contractors. And once they're hired as contractors, that's going to be more flexible for me as a business owner to manage costs, because I can fluctuate with contractors as needed or get leaner in an economic downturn. And so as much as I think flexibility is great, I'm also worried that the shift isn't great for workers who are now business owners, because as business owners, they maybe aren't going to have the same benefits they did as workers. They're not going to have the same job stability that they had as workers. They might have greater earning potential. Like there are some upsides, I think, but I think we want to be aware of the implications this might have for kind of well-being for a worker, whether they are working for themselves or whether they are working for a company. But I do think the preferences matter.
Great. We are just about at time, so I want to be respectful of everyone's time today. First, thank you, Tessa, and thank you, Matt, for sharing the presentation today. And a teaser, again, for those who are interested, we would love for you to join us on June 11th. You can access the next Lunch and Learn on June 11th, same time, noon, This one is going to be focused more on the strategies for growth. So this would be the corresponding policy brief piece, which you can find in the earlier chats with the report and so forth. So again, thank you all for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week, and hopefully I'll see you on June 11th. Take care.